Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I've learned a lot the last couple of days, and my presentation's, I guess, a little bit different than the other ones this morning. Um, my background is in research and epidemiology and demography, and I realize most people don't know what demography is as an academic discipline. So I wanted to start with a little bit of a story about how demography got me into pandemic research and ultimately engagement with the media and science communication. So I think you guys more than anyone were watching the COVID news and numbers very carefully in February of 2020, as I was with my colleagues. And we were really grateful for the great data that was coming out of your public health department, because remember, at this time, we really didn't know much about the virus or how lethal it was. We'd only seen what was happening in Wuhan. We really didn't know if the high fatality rates would transfer into another context. So this was really important data to analyze quickly. And my colleagues and I were looking at this coming out on a daily basis. And you'll notice what we call the case fatality rate in the final column there is the number of people dying per infection. And we know that these numbers, especially in the beginning, were overinflated because we were not capturing everyone who was infected in the denominator. But what did come through really clearly, even acknowledging that, is the strong age patterning that you can see in the mortality. It's very concentrated at older ages, especially over age 60. And so as demographers, this is kind of our bread and butter, is thinking about how population structure affects lots of things. And, a lot of people were asking why mortality was so high in Italy. And we said, kind of along with all demographers at the same time, Italy is one of the oldest countries in the world. 23% of the population was above age 65. And so in thinking about what COVID was going to do to the rest of the world, we thought we really need to think about population age structure and how that will affect the severity of the pandemic and mortality. And we put out a preprint on March 15th and a Twitter thread that kind of blew up and went crazy because people were just really desperate for any information to understand this data. And the long story short is that we compared different countries, different scenarios. So Italy compared to South Korea with very different age structures. And you could see that just based on the age distribution alone in Italy, you would expect many more fatalities than the same percentage of the population infected in Korea, for example. And we also talked about another demographic thing, which was family living arrangements, how in Italy it's much more common to have intergenerational co-residence. And we thought, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, when people didn't know they were spreading it, that this was actually an important conduit of spread. And this was my first experience getting then in the Italian press, where, yes, we were apparently blaming the family, says Oxford, for the high mortality in Italy, which was really not our point, but we wanted to draw attention to the importance of, yes, families and age structure and all these things that might contribute to spread as the pandemic went forward. But this was my introduction. The same weekend, March 15th, is when I got recruited to be a science communicator. With a different group of colleagues who asked me to help them answer questions on Facebook that people were desperately asking their family and friends. And I became very familiar with this idea that we were suddenly facing an overwhelming amount of information, not just misinformation, and helping people kind of curate that and pull out what was important for their life was extremely, extremely important, and something that I think researchers, didn't quite know how to do. And we were also really called by the fact that it felt like a moment where we couldn't sit on the sidelines. There was a lot of information swirling, and I feel like it is our responsibility as scientists to not let that misinformation spread without anything to counterbalance it. It feels like an unfair fight a lot of the time because of the algorithms of social media, but if we don't put the good information out there for people to also find, then it's a really unfair fight. And so our group was also really inspired by this idea that you need to get the good information out there. And I repeatedly hear this, that even people who believe misinformation really strongly, conspiracy theories, if they can stumble across a well-reasoned argument that kind of debunks that misinformation, it gives them a little anchor to start working out that process in their own mind. So we need to get that information out there, but in an easy to digest way, engaging, and what I think is really important that we don't do well in academia is easy for people to share with their friends and families in all of these social media platforms that people use to share. And this led to the creation of our Facebook group. Our Facebook page was the first iteration of what we called Dear Pandemic. And that name came from kind of a riff on the Dear Abby advice columns, so people writing in with their questions. And this was an important part of our idea, was that we wanted to know what was on people's minds. You really need to understand what people's concerns are. So we had a question box and engaged with people a lot in our comment section. And then we got the nickname Those Nerdy Girls from a follower who said he would trust anything those nerdy girls had to say. So those are the first Dear Pandemic for the first couple years, but we've transitioned more to this as a permanent platform that will address not just pandemic issues. And this has been an interdisciplinary team. So again, we were just recruited amongst our friends that we knew at first. We kind of just emailed each other and said, would you be willing to answer a few questions on Facebook? And it really, blossomed into much more. And one of the strengths was that we did bring together interdisciplinary group of scientists and clinicians. And I think this was important because the pandemic obviously is such an interdisciplinary problem. Demography was important, epidemiology, immunology, but also the stuff that was happening on the front lines in the healthcare setting. So it took a lot of perspectives to interpret everything that was happening. And our, real aim, as it came to happen just in real time, we were all not science communicators before, so we were really learning on the fly, was to disseminate trustworthy, comprehensive, and timely content about the pandemic to very general audiences. But we also had this aim that a lot of you have who are here of trying to really give our audience those tools to better understand all of that information themselves. So media and science literacy, which we called information hygiene. We really realized we needed to equip our readers to not only interpret stuff that we were not interpreting for them, but to know, what and how to share things within their own networks. And so we do think this was kind of a unique niche. We have, health, journalism that we've been talking a lot about. We have CDC and other public health agencies who are putting out information. But we were, seeing ourselves as a digital platform where scientists and clinicians came into conversation more directly with these general audiences. And so I think that bi-directional communication and direct access was a unique aspect of what we did. Facebook was our biggest platform that grew to kind of over 100,000 followers very quickly, but we have a website where you can search topics and also put in questions in the question box, and we have Instagram and Twitter and even LinkedIn and a Substack newsletter as well. But people can search for all these topics that we've written about now, over 2,000 posts that we've written. And we did, get a fair amount of media as the pandemic was at its height, and drawing attention to this effort. And we really, have seen it as a potential model for crisis communication. The WHO chose us as a case study for social media crisis communication, and we're in the process of making a handbook also for how this might be replicated. So these are some of the platforms that you can find us on. But I said one of our main efforts is to increase media and science literacy. So we really do have a fair number of posts where we write about how to spot fake news and figure out whether the source is reliable. We talk a lot about uncertainty and shifting scientific guidance. And during the pandemic, that things that we thought at the beginning, that it was, all droplet transmission and wash your hands, a lot of things changed. And we tried to explain that science is a process. It's not a fixed set of facts. And we were transparent about that. We tried to repeat that so that when things changed, we could put that in context and explain to people. And building that trust over time, I think, made, a huge difference in when things, would go crazy later on in the pandemic. And our style, I think, developed a little bit by chance at first because we were a group of women, but we realized we had found some kind of secret sauce in balancing that tightrope between expertise and being approachable. So we all were, credentialed scientists and clinicians, and people seemed to really respect that off the bat. But we came across as someone who might be their neighbor, but also with research expertise who they could ask these questions. So we were the nerdy neighbors next door. And I think that's something that we have a hard time sometimes making ourselves not detached as experts. But I think in this context, you really need to build that relationship more closely. And again, the trustworthy part is also a balancing act, as I said, because we need to acknowledge uncertainty. So we can't say things all the time with complete certainty. We have to kind of hedge and give the caveats that make it most accurate and costs and benefits. But at the same time, in the crisis of the pandemic, people really wanted actionable, practical decisions, So, should I get together with people on Christmas of 2020, or what mask should I wear? People wanted really, really practical tips. And so we were constantly trying to balance our caveat, being very careful with what we were saying versus, but here's the bottom line of how you should, carry that into your daily life. And we had a few nurses in our group at the very beginning, nurse PhDs, so it was a really interesting combination. And they actually taught us that in nursing school, there's a theory of interpersonal relations that is often talked about that really ended up fitting with the type of communication we were doing. And it's called therapeutic communication. And I like this example that nurses walk into rooms as total strangers, listen, and act as a resource to achieve a mutual goal. So nurses are kind of experts in making a desired action seem like your idea. And that's, I think, what ended up being our style in the end. It's really, vital to our approach is that we elicit questions from our question box. We try to find out what was important to the audience, and we do our best to answer those questions and acknowledge people's kind of emotions and where they're coming from with their questions. And that was really, really effective, I think. And we actually even wrote a paper kind of highlighting this approach as using this therapeutic communication as a style for crisis communication during the infodemic. And these are just some of the other real tactics that I think worked well for us, really listening, leading with empathy, acknowledging that people were stressed out or that they might not be able to always be perfect with their precautions, acknowledging the complexity of real life. And also repetition was really important during the pandemic, as I'm sure a lot of you guys experienced. And these were some of the examples where we talked about not only practical pandemic things, but also kind of the mental health and anxiety aspect of the pandemic and acknowledging that people were really, really anxious. And I'll also say, even with respect to the actual pandemic, precautions or, a new variant that came out that was getting a lot of headlines, we saw our role as kind of de-escalating people's emotions and anxiety, which was counter to a lot of social media algorithms where you're rewarded for making things seem more scary, or heightening emotions and anger and outrage. And we really actively chose to take the opposite approach and to kind of try to calm people down and say, new variants are expected. The virus is going to change. It doesn't always mean they're going to be completely evading our immunity. And so we strive to kind of preserve that trust rather than, heighten people's emotions. And again, this worked really well, I think, for the long game of building those relationships. And we know social media is a double-edged sword. There's tons of misinformation out there, but we did think for better or for worse, you have to fight that infodemic on its own turf. And so that's where people are going for their health information, and that's where they can easily share it with their friends and family. So we, just wanted to fight back the best we could and get that information into those trusted networks, at the same time teaching people to be better interpreters of that information in the first place. And as I said, people really wanted to apply general guidance to, help applying the general public health guidance to their specific situations, which, led us to making lots of kind of flow charts and decision-making guides for people, because it was really hard to just hear about, isolation lengths or social distancing and then try to apply it to your situation with different family members and different vaccination status, et cetera. So, we did our best to try to meet that need and help people make the general guidance more specific. But this one on the right is just a funny example, I think, of how specific some people wanted us to be with their questions. The question box was really enlightening. But on the left, it's not just about wear a mask, that, it's what kind of mask, and then it's like in what situation, and if I have glasses and my ears are big, like people really, really want very specific guidance. So I think if you can do that, it's really helpful. And this was just another example that I found really funny, asking us in a long-winded way. So it says, my son's girlfriend recently had squirrels removed from her attic. They now have mysterious bites. Our son caught a flea on his clothes. They live in Toronto, which is suffering from a surge of coronavirus. They have not been immunized because of low supply. Can fleas be carriers of COVID? So we really relied on our readers for some comic relief, but we knew this was actually an earnest question, so we always treat that with great respect. But it was really interesting to kind of understand what level people were coming from. And I think as the pandemic went on, we saw the level of complexity increase, which has been a challenge in our messaging. In the beginning it was, can I go outside at all? And as we started to get vaccinations, things got a lot more complicated, and we had to adapt our messaging to do that. And I really, as an epidemiologist and demographer, found it a great opportunity to kind of do these explainers for people on kind of statistics and base rates and the things that you guys have talked about for the media. And this was an example, again, of kind of misinformation that was coming out, that because a high percentage during the Delta wave of hospitalizations in the UK were among the vaccinated, that was being taken by the anti-vaxxers to say the vaccines didn't work. And so, I could write something that showed that this was really just a function of almost everyone in the UK was vaccinated, over 90%. And so that actually, meant that you would expect a decent number of people who are vaccinated to be among the infected. 40% being vaccinated is not a big surprise, and actually can show that means that the risk is much, much lower for the vaccinated compared to the unvaccinated, but that, and it was something then again that can be shared with people amongst their family and friends when their, uncle makes that assertion at the dinner table that the vaccines aren't working. We kind of give people the tools, something to share. So these were some of our major lessons learned, was that you really want to foster trust in science, which again means explaining to people that science is a changing landscape where we test things and update our knowledge, that it's not that it would never change. And also teaching people how to find those trusted sources and trusted people. And we'd like to really see more scientists engaging, getting out there into the trenches and engaging in this type of communication. It's not something I did before the pandemic, and we're not trained to do it, but that's something we'd like to change a little bit, give people more confidence to do that. Because I think even any of you, on your social medias, if you wrote something during the pandemic, I'm sure your family and friends were really grateful and would want to have shared that information. So don't underestimate, the power of your own influence. People really do are grateful for this, for clear, useful information that they can share. Anticipate the misinformation and kind of fight that on these platforms. We have to fight it where it already exists on social media. We wanted to lead with empathy. People have really complicated lives, so we try to remember that too. We really focused on plain language and simplifying messages. I know we were saying we can't simplify too much for some of the nuances of the science, but as far as giving people kind of the bottom line, well, first, put it up top. What is the thing they should take away from what you're writing? But then also, if you're describing a scientific study, what might they take away for their actual daily life? I think giving them that piece is really, really helpful. And we got lots of great feedback that kind of kept us motivated during the pandemic. It was very hard to do an actual evaluation, but we took messages from our followers to heart. People saying that they shared something with their friend and it really changed their, a decision about a risk they were about to take, and that they trusted the vaccines because they had been following us for months and really had already, built that level of trust with what we were saying. So all of this was really heartening because this was really hard. And I'll say this was all volunteer work for all of us on top of our regular jobs. So I kind of want to pitch, I guess, to you guys that science communication on social media is a really valuable way to spread communication and good information and get it out into other people's social networks. So it was reaching not only our followers, but they were sharing with their local public health departments and school districts. And it was getting into these local social networks. And I think we kind of underestimate the power of that distribution of social media. And again, think about this kind of therapeutic communication style of leading with empathy and not be, acting like a detached expert or a public health, director who's kind of scolding people to make good decisions. We need to understand all aspects of people's lives. And so finding the right information, giving the right information to maybe the right messenger in a local community, you can help do that, and that can make all the difference for getting people the message and taking action. And so that was a very short version. I'm happy to talk later during the breaks more, but we are going to keep this effort going because we focus to more general health and science topics. And so, if anyone wants to do guest writing or interviews for those nerdy girls, please let me know. Thank you.